This is a Swedish sci-fi movie, which is a phrase I personally haven't heard a lot. And it's actually a surprisingly ambitious movie as well. And I really admire the resourcefulness of the filmmakers. I've always liked when small productions have to get creative. When they have to figure out how to achieve their goals on a limited budget. I mean, anyone could have made this movie with $100 million. But I doubt this cost more than a couple, because that's the budget of an average Swedish movie. So they were forced to work with what they had, and I really like what they came up with. But first of all, the story here is about a massive spaceship called Aniara. It's on its way to Mars when things go terribly wrong, as it usually does in movies like this. And the story essentially follows the people on board as they try to deal with the situation. And let's just say it takes a few interesting twists and turns along the way. I don't feel like this is a story I've seen before. It felt pretty unique. And I'm trying not to give anything away, but just the way the whole thing is structured is different. And the whole approach it takes to a story like this felt fresh. This is definitely not your average Hollywood sci-fi romp. It takes a way more grounded approach and mainly focuses on the people on board and how they adjust and behave and, well, deal with this new development. But at the same time it also tries to get a little bit more cerebral. Because there's this sort of relaxation chamber on board, and the main character is in charge of this facility, and that sort of starts to play into the story as well. So it tries to get a little bit heady and philosophical at certain points. But I do have to say tries, because I couldn't help but to feel like the movie thought it was a bit smarter than it actually was. It didn't really get that deep into it or present that many interesting ideas, but it did dip its toe into that kind of stuff, and I definitely didn't mind that. Ultimately though, it didn't feel that rewarding. It didn't feel like it really paid off. And the overall story here, well, I did like it, but I definitely didn't love it. It was sorta interesting, it held my attention, and it did feel fresh and unique. But overall, I don't know, it felt like it maybe lacked a little bit of poignancy, I wanna say. It didn't feel that focused, it didn't feel like it really knew what it was trying to do. But what I did like quite a bit was the production side of things. Because as I mentioned earlier, this probably didn't have a huge budget. And it is pretty ambitious, so they had to get a little bit creative. So instead of building massive expensive sets and using a ton of green screen and CGI, they just used actual real-life locations for most of the indoor scenes, and then sort of subtly converted those spaces to look a little bit more futuristic. Things like shopping malls, hotels, office buildings, that sort of thing. They just picked locations that made sense and shot them in a way that made it all look somewhat coherent. I mean, it's still very obvious that's what they did here, if you pay attention. But I think it worked, I didn't find it to be distracting at all. After all, the ship is supposed to be absolutely massive. And it's supposed to house civilians for extended periods of time too. So it does make sense that it would look less like a conventional spaceship and more like a modern city. And I just love it when filmmakers figure out how to pull something like this off. Because on paper this shouldn't be a low-budget movie. It really shouldn't be possible to make this on a budget without the end result suffering. And yeah, it's clearly not a Christopher Nolan movie, you know? That much is obvious, but I think they made it work. And even the CGI was acceptable. Not great, but acceptable. It didn't detract from the experience. Nor did the acting or anything else really. I thought it was all fine. And I especially liked Anneli Martini's character. She plays an astronomer. It's a fairly small role, but I thought it was pretty funny what they did with that character. She just doesn't care what anyone else thinks and says what's on her mind, in a very deadpan manner. So yeah, I thought that was funny. That being said, this is not a comedy. She's pretty much the only funny thing about it. It's more of a drama. Or well, I don't know what to call it actually. I guess you could call it existential horror too if you'd really want to. But it's definitely not a conventional horror movie either. And stylistically it sits firmly on the art house side of the spectrum. And I wouldn't call it hard sci-fi or space opera or anything like that either. It's essentially a low-key sci-fi drama with a mix of other stuff thrown in there, I guess. And I sorta liked it. It didn't feel like just some rehashed old ideas with nothing new thrown into the mix. But at the same time, it did feel a little bit pointless, I guess. And you know, maybe that was the point. It could very well be. But anyway, would I recommend it? For fans of low-budget sci-fi, I'd say yes. For other people, probably not. It's pretty safe to skip. Or don't, I'm not your dad. But I am trying to sell out, so consider liking, subbing, hitting that bell, and supporting me on Patreon. Because I really need to call Elon Musk and book myself a trip to Mars. And hey, why not drop a comment below or check out another review? I'd appreciate it. Thanks.